But good afternoon, and it's lovely to be here as well in this conference, in this event. I'm Christine Beherasco from Withsecure. So this is an end-to-end cybersecurity company with headquarters in Helsinki, Finland, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of Withsecure. And today, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of the learnings that a midlife person who has spent 2 decades in the cybersecurity industry and looking back into the past. Because sometimes you can call it a midlife crisis, but sometimes they also say that life begins at 40. So this is an opportunity to look back. And there are 3 lessons that I would like to impart. So firstly, as human beings, we will continue building new technologies on top of the old ones, because this is how we solve problems, this is how we advance civilization, and this is why we keep on building new technologies, for example, like the chat version of GPT that we have recently seen. Secondly, the internet, our digital dimension, is meant to be open. It's meant to be interconnected. It's meant to be borderless. Therefore, all of these geopolitical boundaries and the boundaries that we have across different organizations are actually helpful to attackers. They're helpful for threat actors because they are very opportunistic, and these are crippling us, but it's enabling them because it's making us lower. And finally, thirdly, this real world that we have today, it is already both physical and digital. And therefore, it's good for us to realize, because governments are also realizing already, that you can't really switch off anymore. We're living online. And therefore, it's essential to understand that cybersecurity hasn't really grown together with these technologies. Cybersecurity is chasing these technologies. So we're trying to secure something that has already been set up. And therefore, it would be good to build new models for the future. And today I'm going to share with you some of these threats that we have seen in the past 20 years, because we have become so good at adopting new technologies, like quickly adopting them. Imagine software as a service. Organizations can deploy them within 5 minutes. But we have become so bad at retiring old technologies. Like, think of servers in a basement of different organizations. It takes years to even retire that, even though it may not be very well patched. And if we have different technologies that are just being built on top of older ones, then the attack surface that we have just keeps getting wider and wider. And I'm going to show you some of the threats that we have seen. Some of them are actually classics. So email as a technology, it has been around for more than 2 decades. And if you think about it, the past 10 years, we have had technologies like Teams or Slack, that if you think about it, within your organization, does email really have a use? Why do we keep on sending each other emails inside the organization when there are other technologies that could already replace them? Maybe it's because us dinosaurs are really in love with our emails. And at the end of the day, we still add the new ones. We have the old ones, we add the new ones, and therefore old threats like phishing, they are still there, but we keep on adding new threats as well, using like phishing, using files, and there are even more sophisticated forms of phishing, like business email compromise, which the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the US has mentioned last year that it has already been a $43 billion threat. And that's almost double the numbers that they had before COVID times. And it just keeps on getting better, because we had a research last year which our researchers utilized ChatGPT on how you can build emails that are more convincing. So imagine a company just recently having a press release, and they have a very specific capability, very specific product that they mentioned there. Nothing is stopping an attacker from utilizing information from that, plugging that into ChatGPT and asking them to create a very convincing, very professional sounding email, and then this is the email that can be used for a person that has been in a business email compromise. And in one of our incident response engagements, we have seen that a higher senior ranking manager in an organization actually got their Office 365 account compromised, and then they started sending emails to their teams which contained malicious links. So email is one thing that is sort of like a classic. But our endpoint devices, so your Windows operating systems, your Mac, your Linux, they have been around for more than 20 years as well. And Windows, although it has lost market share during the past 20 years, it is still the most dominant operating system out there. And today, the most notorious threat that we have seen that are targeting endpoint operating systems is ransomware. Now, ransomware is an interesting look into the psychology of attackers. Because I just realized as well when I was creating this presentation that the first crypto ransomware, so this is the ransomware that actually encrypts files and asks for cryptocurrency as payment, came out in 2013. So that was CryptoLocker. And that was 10 years ago. So 10 years to this day, this has been one of the more successful models, more successful threats that we have seen in the landscape. And this is because these threat actors, they keep on evolving. So from 2013 to 2017, they were just massively building new ransomware variants. And there are different ransomware families. They just keep on rising up until 2017. And then come to 2018, completely dropped. And 2018 was the time that these ransomware threat actors realized that after all of the spamming that they did when it comes to this ransomware, individuals, when they get infected, they don't pay. They don't pay the ransom because, for one, it may be very expensive. It's too expensive for one person. But companies, businesses, organizations, the public sector, if they lose time because of a ransomware attack, then it's not really good for business because they lose money as well. So they end up paying the ransom. So the ransomware threat actors, they realize this, they move their models to targeting businesses instead. And that started heavily in 2018. And when they targeted businesses, they realized that these emails, they don't work as well. So they needed to target businesses using new infection vectors. And that's also quite expensive because now you have to target businesses using these infection vectors. You still have to build the ransomware. You still need to have this customer service that actually supports the infected victims. And you still have to have the initial entry into the organization. So there's a lot of things to do. And so at the end of the day, they specialized. So Emotet, for instance, is one of the threats, have been around since 2014. They changed their model in 2016 so that they can specialize as a malware distributor. That's all they do. They prepare the estate for distribution, and they can deploy the ransomware. And the ransomware threat actors, they can focus on building the ransomware, and then they can focus on supporting infected victims. And then there are also others who are the ones that are distributing the ransomware, infecting organizations with them, so they bring two and two together. And once they do that, they are the ones that our incident responders actually see in the estate. Because when we get in, and when we realize we have a customer that had a ransomware infection, we see the ones that are distributing the ransomware. Not the ransomware creators, not the ones who are providing the initial infection, but the ones who are distributing it. And they are the ones who are using legitimate tools that IT administrators use to get into the network, to get into the different systems, to move throughout the estate so that they can find the data that they would like to compromise. And they even perform further social engineering. For instance, they may call the person who owns one of the devices and then ask them to install further remote access tools like AnyDesk or TeamViewer. And then after that, of course, they deploy the ransomware. And this has continued to be very effective, even though there are many players, because they get ransom in the millions. So there's a lot of money to divide around these different operators. Another technology that we have seen is actually a technology that has not been around 20 years ago. And this is infrastructure as a service, the cloud, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, for instance, or Azure. And of course, some of the old threats that worked in general purpose operating systems don't really work here. But the cloud is very helpful for different organizations because you can deploy very quickly and you can scale as high as you want or as low as you want if that's all you need. And you don't need to maintain the underlying hardware, which is actually quite valuable for many organizations. But it also means that as a threat actor, if I can scale as much as I want, there is a threat for which cryptocurrency didn't even exist 20 years ago. But this is the type of threat that is based on cryptocurrency because there is value in cryptocurrency, and if you mine it, you need a lot of resources. And if you can use the resources of those organizations that have these cloud platforms, then essentially you're printing money using their money. So it's just money out of the organization that goes into the attacker's pocket. And these are two separate incident response cases that we have seen. So the first one was a web server of an organization that was in Azure had its UI application vulnerable for 4 days after the patch was released. Only 4 days. The attacker compromised it and then installed a crypto miner. So if you have a web server, the beauty of having that in the cloud is that you can only scale up when you have more visitors and then scale down if you have less visitors. But of course, if you have a crypto miner there, then it can be scaled to as high as is allowed by your configuration. Another incident response case that we had was with Google Cloud Platform, where the service accounts were exposed and afterwards they were used to enumerate the different resources in order to find where to install not the ransomware, but the crypto miner. And that's exactly what the attacker did as well. Another thing that was not around 20 years ago are these different platforms that we use today, which also reflects the reputation of the organization, like social media. So there are many businesses that have Facebook accounts. And last year, our researchers have discovered Ducktail, which is what essentially happens with Ducktail is once you have the malware in your device, then it will try to see if there are Facebook sessions that are available in the browser, and it will try to check if the account on this device is linked to a business account in Facebook. And then they will try to add the account of the threat actor. So the purpose of this is that imagine if an organization already has many different followers in Facebook and they have a trusted reputation, then the threat actor can just basically use their platform to deploy further attacks, to deploy messages to their customers, which is exactly what the attacker also has done. And then one more thing. So the past 20 years, we had this massive growth of different technologies, new technologies coming into play, and software as a service is one of those things where the data in your organization, you can't really contain it anymore within your perimeter because you send it out to those that are managing your software. And this causes our supply chain not only to be very complicated, but also to be interlinked now in both the physical and digital aspects. And if you can get past the very tiny font, which you probably can't read it, but if you can read it. So these are only some of the hundreds of supply chain attacks that we have seen in the past decade. And some of the things on this list are linked to industrial control systems or laptop update facilities, operating system, text editor, games, open source code. The list goes on. There is no clear pattern to what type of software is being used in a supply chain attack because threat actors are opportunistic, so they're just using this as a platform to get towards the targets that are using this type of software. But one thing that has really emerged in the past few years is the heavy use of open source code in supply chain attacks. Because let me ask you for a moment, do you know any organization that does not use open source code? I always get this answer as well, like when I talk to other developers, the ones who are really packing these codes into the software. Because one of the beauty of what we have seen in the past 2 decades was that we no longer need to reinvent the wheel. We can use open source code out there for encryption, for imaging, for geolocations, like different things can already be used from code that's already available. But of course, the threat actors know this. And so they try to trick the different tools that we have that pull open source code so that the malicious code is instead being pulled instead of the legitimate open source code. And because of this, we have seen, even last year, that there are hundreds, thousands of different libraries that are actually infected with these different supply chain attacks that are using open source code, because it's easier to impact these libraries rather than to hack an organization, to get into their defenses, to package your malware into their software deployment, and then push that to their customers. For this one, you just need to trick the tools that are using open source code, and then you get the malicious, the malware into the systems of the users. But at the end of the day, so I have a technical background. I was a malware researcher at the beginning of my career. And usually, how I explain these things, like how do we secure ourselves in this modern ecosystem? I give people like, these are the solutions that we can do. And if I'm talking to a CISO, if I'm talking to a cybersecurity expert, they'll be like, yeah, it makes sense. I want multi-layered protection capabilities, have my developers shift left. They get it. And then maybe they go back and then they compare this with what they have. But if I'm talking to executives or I'm talking to the board of directors, they're probably out the door already by now. Like I wouldn't get any budget explaining these things to them. Maybe the cybersecurity awareness trainings will get something. But the rest is sort of, well, I might as well be speaking French because like nobody would understand. So that's a tough thing about the language that we're using. And to be honest, it's not that we are trying to deliberately confuse people. It's just that it's all the language we know. I mean, cybersecurity as a discipline is pretty young. It's less than 40 years old. And this has been started by practitioners or people like myself who have been used to building solutions for threats. So what did we have in the past? We had malware, we created a solution. We had another malware, we created another solution. So it's a very threat-based model. And then we realized at some point, hey, wait a minute. This malware had the same behavior as that malware. Maybe we can create a framework. So we created the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And when we had a MITRE ATT&CK framework, it was still very technical. So we created something high level, like the Lockheed Martin kill chain. And we understood each other way better, but then the IT people who needed to implement what we are trying to do didn't really understand us. So we created new models, like asset-based models, for example, the Cyber Defense Matrix by Sunil Yu, where you have assets on one side and then the NIST cybersecurity framework on another side, and then you can put in solutions nicely in these little boxes. And then we say that, yes, we are now understanding each other. But we didn't get any funding because it's still very technical, exactly. So then we used a risk-based model, which is already pretty helpful because many different organizations, especially when they're more mature, already have risk management. So cyber risk is just one of the risks anyway, so we can treat it like any risk. But the challenge with this model as well is that when we prioritize these things, we prioritize them as cybersecurity experts based on the potential impact that the threat may have to the organization, not based on the strategy of the organization or where the organization wants to go, because sometimes CEOs, they will just tell the CISO, I just want you to secure the organization, make sure we don't have breaches. That's it. That's a really big ask, by the way, and it's also a very vague ask. So this is why we're introducing outcome-based model. Because at the end of the day, businesses want outcomes. They have a strategy, and this strategy has certain outcomes that the business would like to go towards. And cybersecurity needs to be about, when you have these outcomes, you don't need to throw away the other models, but when you have these outcomes, what are the risks then to these outcomes? And what are the assets that are at risk before we talk about what are the threats to these assets? So bear with me for a moment. Some examples, just to provide some color to this. So what if the outcome that the organization wants is maximize productivity? Every executive, every board of director gets what you will be talking about, even though it may sound very high level to technical experts. So if you want to maximize productivity, you want to be more efficient, You want to go to the cloud, of course, because you want to be more efficient, very quick. The risk to that is maybe if you auto-scale beyond what your budget allows for your operating expenses, that's not going to be very good for your outcome. And the asset could be, for instance, the web server that we had in Azure, the one that I explained earlier in our incident response case, and a threat could be crypto miners. Another example, increased competitiveness. So an organization that wants to move very fast, want to be very competitive, they would like to deploy software very quickly in their organization. So go software as a service, but then the risk could be that who is the SaaS provider really? Because this customer data, this employee data, this company internal data is now going out of your organization towards the SaaS provider. How are they securing their estate? Like, how is your third-party risk management working? So that could be the risk. And then, of course, the asset could be the data that you have from your company. And a threat could be a data breach to your SaaS provider. And then a final one, strengthen business resilience, especially in the economic condition that we have nowadays. Many businesses would like to thrive and emerge on the other side of this. And of course, you would like to keep the reputation, which could be the asset. The reputation of the applications, the services that this organization has. And the risk to that could be that if an organization introduced malware in the estate of their customers, that can actually erode the reputation of this provider. And then supply chain attack could be a risk to that. And if we frame those same solutions that I have been explaining earlier, the same very technical solutions in this context, that these are the solutions for these outcomes, and these are the solutions that actually impact 3 outcomes. They de-risk 3 outcomes, and these are the other ones. Then the conversation becomes more continuous. From the board of directors to the executive teams, they suddenly begin to understand what you're talking about, even though they still don't understand the detail of the solutions, but they know what are the outcomes that we, the cybersecurity practitioners, are trying to secure. And this is still understandable all the way to the technical level because there's still continuity from risk to assets all the way to threats. And what we're also introducing today is co-security, because the digital world today, I mean, the real world is both digital and physical, and everything is interconnected. As an organization, you can't really secure things alone. Like, you have suppliers. There are cybersecurity vendors that are supplying your products, your services. You have suppliers of payroll. You have suppliers of legal software. And you have CRM suppliers. And then you have customers who could be impacted when you are impacted. How are we holistically securing this? There needs to be partnerships across the board, not just with a cybersecurity vendor, but with somebody who, for instance, who's managing the security in your organization, who's helping the organization navigate the space, and also with suppliers that may not even be related to cybersecurity as well. Because if we want to work with organizations that have a higher level of cybersecurity posture, then at the end of the day, we are much more secure ourselves. Like, our organizations are not islands in this interconnected world. We need to be working like communities in order to co-secure things together. If you want to have a chat a bit more about co-security, my colleagues are going to be in booth B36, correct? B32. B32, sorry. And we can discuss more about cybersecurity and who are the different players that could help secure. And even governments actually can be quite helpful in this regard. It remains to be seen what kind of future we're going to be building, because with human civilization, us moving things forward by building on top of technologies that have already been there, then it becomes a question of, are we building a house of cards that could be problematic tomorrow? Or are we building organizations? Are we building a digital world that's going to be more secure by design for the future, for our future and our children's future? Thank you very much for your time. I'm still going to be there at the back if you have more questions, and thank you for your attention. Merci beaucoup.